In the autumn of 1944, as the Third Army remained stalled in Lorraine, the Judge Advocate General's section began compiling files on suspected violations of the Geneva Convention with greater systematic care. These were not yet formal indictments, but detailed records assembled with the intention of preserving evidence for whatever tribunal might come after the war. One of the early incidents documented in those files was the death of Frances Slanger, the first American Army nurse killed by enemy fire in the European theater after Normandy. Patton did not need a symbol, he needed a record, and in the months that followed, that record continued to grow. This is the story of what that file became, and of the general who, more than a year later, would die before he ever heard a single verdict it produced. To understand what happened in that tent that afternoon, we have to go back just a few hours to the moment a young woman in another tent, 10 miles closer to the German line, sat down to write a letter she would never mail. The pen moved across the paper by the light of a single bulb strung from the canvas ceiling. Outside the tent, somewhere in the cold black distance, an American artillery battery answered a German one, then fell silent. The pen kept moving. It was just past midnight, October 21st, 1944. The 45th Field Hospital sat in a clearing behind the front lines near Elsenborn, Belgium, less than a dozen miles from the German border. The wind carried the smell of wet pine and burnt fuel and something else underneath it, something the nurses had learned not to name. The woman at the desk did not look up. Her name was Frances Slanger. She was 31 years old, a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps, and she was writing what she did not know would be her last letter. She wrote to the editors of Stars and Stripes. The newspaper had been running stories about American soldiers, about their courage, their suffering, the long winter ahead. Slanger wanted to push back. The soldiers had been thanking the nurses. She wanted to thank them. "It is to you we doff our helmets," she wrote. She finished the letter. She folded it. She put it in an envelope. She would mail it in the morning. There would be no morning for Frances Slanger. At approximately 2 o'clock, a single German artillery shell came whistling out of the dark. 3 nurses shared the tent. The shell struck close. The canvas walls erupted in a percussive bloom of light and metal and noise. By the time the smoke cleared, the other 2 nurses were wounded. Frances Slanger was dying. She did not last the hour. She became the first American Army nurse killed by enemy fire in the European theater after the invasion of Normandy. She had been born Friada Slanger in Bulge, Poland, in 1913. Her family had fled the pogroms when she was a child. They had come to Boston with almost nothing, and her father had peddled fruit from a cart in the streets, while her mother kept the small apartment clean and warm. Frances had become a nurse the slow way, working full-time, studying at night, paying her own tuition. She graduated from the Boston City Hospital School of Nursing in 1937. When America entered the war, she volunteered. She had crossed the Atlantic on a troop ship in the summer of 1944. She had landed in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day. She had worked in field hospitals across France and Belgium, sleeping in mud, treating soldiers whose faces she would never see again, writing letters, home to a mother who could barely read English. Now she was gone. 3 days later, her letter reached the offices of Stars and Stripes in Paris. The editors held it. They held it for 2 weeks. They wanted to verify what had happened. When the confirmation came back, when they understood that the woman who had written on those lines was already buried, they published it. It ran on November 7th, 1944, on the front page. The newspaper printed her photograph beside the text. A young woman with dark hair pulled back, a small, uncertain smile, the bars of her rank on her collar. The story moved across the American sector like weather. It was read aloud at evening mess. It was passed hand to hand through the mud and the cold. Soldiers who had never met her wrote letters to her mother. Within a month, the United States Army would name a hospital ship for Frances Slanger. This is the part the popular memory keeps: the letter, the photograph, the hospital ship, the making of a symbol. What we know from the surviving records of the European theatre is that incidents like the shelling of the 45th Field Hospital prompted Judge Advocate General sections across American commands to begin compiling files on suspected Geneva Convention violations with greater systematic care. Not as confirmed war crimes in every case, but as documented incidents under investigation, with the intention of preserving evidence for whatever tribunal might come after the war. George Patton, commanding the Third Army from his forward headquarters in Nancy, France, was one of the generals who insisted that such records be kept complete and thorough. He was 58 years old that autumn, 3 weeks short of his 59th birthday, a man who had spent 4 decades in uniform. He moved differently than he had in August. The fire was still there, the pacing, the abrupt half-turns, the habit of standing too close to a map and talking at it as though it could be persuaded. But underneath the performance, he was tired in a way the staff had begun to notice. He was tired the way a man gets tired when the strategy that has worked for him his whole career has stopped working. Through August, the Third Army had moved with a speed that bordered on the unbelievable. Patton had crossed France in less time than some of his divisions could organize their own supply trains. He had taken cities the planners had not expected him to reach until winter. And then, in early September, the trucks of the Red Bull Express, the supply convoy system that had been feeding his advances, began to run dry. The math had finally caught up with the war. By the middle of September, his tanks were sitting in the open with empty fuel cells. By October, the entire Third Army front had ground to a halt across a sector of muddy ridges and stone villages in the region the maps called Lorraine. The Germans, who had been routed in August, had used the pause to dig in. They had brought in fresh divisions. They had fortified ground that Patton had expected to take in days. By the time Frances Slanger's letter arrived in Paris, the war in Patton's sector had taken on a texture much older than the war the headlines were describing. It was beginning to look like 1917. Trenches, fields turned into killing grounds, men dying for farmhouses that nobody outside the regiment would ever name. Into this landscape on a cold afternoon in late October, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman, the general's aide, carried reports into the headquarters tent. Codman was 51 years old. He had served with Patton in the First World War. He had volunteered again for the Second. He was a Boston man, fluent in French, a man who had once owned a wine business and who, by the strange arithmetic of war, now spent his days organizing the paper that surrounded a general. He knew Patton's moods. He had learned over many months how to read which report needed to go on the top of which pile. Patton read the reports that crossed his desk. He read them through. There was a stillness in the general that the staff officers had learned to fear more than the shouting. The shouting was theater. The stillness was something else. What we know from the surviving Third Army records and from Codman's later memoir is that in this period the Judge Advocate General's section of the Third Army began compiling files of suspected Geneva Convention violations, not as confirmed war crimes in most cases, as documented incidents under investigation with intent unresolved. The 45th Field Hospital was a designated medical installation. The tents bore the Red Cross of the Geneva Convention. German aerial reconnaissance had photographed similar locations more than once. The trajectory of the single shell was inconclusive. There was no German prisoner to interrogate. There was no captured order. There was no evidence yet on which to build a case. Patton's standing instruction to his JAG officers, repeated in different language in different rooms across that autumn, came down to a single proposition. The record would be complete. Every incident, every shell, every dead nurse and every dead medic. The intent could not be proven now. It might be provable later. The war would end. The Germans would surrender. There would be prisoners. There would be captured documents. There would be a tribunal, somewhere, somehow, and that tribunal would need evidence, and the evidence would not exist unless someone had begun to gather it now. The work of building that record began in earnest. This was not the Patton of the newsreels. This was not the man with the ivory-handled revolvers who had slapped 2 enlisted soldiers in a hospital tent in Sicily the year before and nearly lost his career for it. This was a different officer entirely, a quiet man at a desk, ordering the slow, patient work of building a paper case against a category of crime that did not yet have a formal name in international law. Commanders like Patton were already operating on the principle that evidence must be preserved, even though the legal architecture for individual criminal liability for violations of the laws of war was still being argued by lawyers and diplomats in London and Washington. The charter of the International Military Tribunal would not be signed until August of 1945. The legal architecture for individual criminal liability for violations of the laws of war was still being argued by lawyers and diplomats in offices in London and Washington. Patton, in a tent in Nancy, was already operating on the principle the world had not yet codified. The folder grew through the rest of October, through November, through into the dark of December. The Judge Advocate General's section of the Third Army assembled what the field could produce. Statements from surviving nurses at the 45th, sketches of the shell's impact point, photographs of the Red Cross markings as they had appeared from the German side of the line. The work was patient. It was unglamorous. It was the kind of work a soldier did when he understood that justice, real justice, the kind that survives a war, was not made in speeches. It was made in files. And the file on Frances Slanger had a particular weight that no one in that tent yet understood, because the third turn of this story had not yet revealed itself. It would reveal itself through a name no one in Patton's headquarters knew. The name was Reba Whittle. She was 25 years old. She was a flight nurse, a second lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps, born in a small town in Texas to a family of cattle people. She had been raised on horseback and trained in a hospital in Los Angeles. She had been assigned to a medical evacuation squadron, flying C-47 transports between the front and the rear area hospitals. The aircraft were unarmed. They were marked conspicuously and unmistakably with the Red Cross of the Geneva Convention. On the morning of September 27, 1944, less than a month before the shell that killed Frances Slanger, Reba Whittle's C-47 had been hit by German anti-aircraft fire over Aachen, near the German border. The aircraft had gone down inside enemy territory. Whittle had survived the crash. She had been wounded. She had been taken into German custody. She was the only American military nurse held as a prisoner of war by Germany in the entirety of the Second World War. The Germans, when they realized what they had captured, did not seem to know what to do with her. The Geneva Convention had not anticipated the situation. They moved her from facility to facility. They held her for 4 months. They eventually released her in January of 1945 as part of a prisoner exchange. She would survive the war. She would carry the experience for the rest of her life, the way some people carry a stone in a shoe they never take off. Whittle's existence in German custody during the same weeks that German artillery was killing Frances Slanger meant something specific. It meant that the German military command knew, at the level of formal documentation, that American women in uniform were operating as protected medical personnel in the European theater. They had seen the markings. They had read the orders. They had photographed the field hospitals. There would be no claim of ignorance. There could be no claim of confusion. Whatever the German artillery had done in the dark of October 21st, whatever the German officers across the line had ordered or permitted or looked away from, they had done it with full knowledge of what the targets were. In a tent in Nancy, in a folder that was beginning to thicken, the record was being kept. The winter was coming. In 63 days, German tanks would burst out of the Ardennes forest, and the rules that George Patton had spent the autumn quietly insisting on would be tested in ways that nothing in the autumn campaign had prepared the Third Army to face. But that was December. In October, in the cold tent in Nancy, a 58-year-old general closed a folder and slid it across a desk and said only what was necessary. Begin the file. The folder grew thicker through November. It was kept in a locked box in the corner of the Judge Advocate General's tent at Third Army Headquarters, and by the second week of December, it had outgrown the box and required a second one. The second box began to fill. Reports came in from forward units across the entire front. Medics killed at close range after crossing the line under flags of truce. Ambulances fired on. Surgical tents shelled with what the JAG investigators concluded, after measuring trajectories and interviewing prisoners, was deliberate targeting. The specifics varied. The category did not. The file thickened. The work was quiet. The cold deepened. And then, in the second week of December, something else began to happen in the folder. It began to gather reports about American soldiers. This is the part of the story that the popular memory has worked hardest to bury. It is also, in its own difficult way, the truest measure of the man George Patton was that autumn. Because Patton, who had spent October and November documenting German violations of the Geneva Convention, had also instructed the JAG section to document violations committed by his own troops. The same standard, the same paper, the same patient assembly of evidence. American soldiers, in the exhaustion of the autumn fighting, were committing their own violations. Prisoners shot in woods, wounded enemies finished off, surrender refused. The Third Army's JAG office logged each one with the same patients it brought to the German files. The folder included them all. Patton did not believe in selective law. He believed, as a matter of operational philosophy, that he had argued for 30 years, that an army which abandoned its own discipline could not be trusted to fight effectively when the test came. He had told his staff this in different language, in different rooms, in different theaters of the war. You could not ask men to die in formation for a flag, he said, if you also told them, in the same breath, that the flag's rules applied only to the enemy. The whole structure collapsed. The whole structure had to apply both ways, or it did not apply at all. So the folder grew on both sides. It would matter, this fact, in the weeks ahead in ways that no one in the JAG tent could yet anticipate. Because the test of the principle was coming, and the test would not be measured in October artillery shells fired by men Patton would never meet. It would be measured in his own soldiers, on the snow, on the first day of 1945, but that was January. On the night of December 15th, 1944, the Wehrmacht moved. The American line through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg was held by 4 divisions across an 85-mile front. 2 of the divisions were brand new. They had not seen combat. The other 2 had been pulled out of heavy fighting and rotated into what the planners had designated a quiet sector, a place where exhausted units could recover. The forest was thick. The hills were steep. The roads were narrow and easily blocked. Allied intelligence had concluded that the Germans were finished as an offensive force in the West. The conclusion was wrong. At 5:30 in the morning of December 16th, In heavy fog and falling snow, German artillery opened along the entire Ardennes front. 20 German divisions began moving west, with another 10 in reserve behind them. The 6th Panzer Army on the right, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, the 7th Army on the left. The objective, in Hitler's mind, was the Belgian port of Antwerp. The objective, in reality, was to split the American and British armies, force a separate peace in the West, and free Germany to concentrate against the Soviets in the East. It was the largest and most desperate offensive the Germans would launch in the Western theater of the war. It would be called, by the men who fought it, the Battle of the Bulge, and the spearhead of the German attack on the northern shoulder was Kampfgruppe Piper. The unit was named for its commander, Joachim Piper, an SS officer 29 years old, blonde, photogenic, fluent in English, decorated, ruthless. He had risen through the SS officer corps in Russia, where the rules of war had been suspended for years by everyone on both sides, and he had come west with the habits of that suspension intact. His Kampfgruppe was the cutting edge of the 1st SS Panzer Division. It comprised approximately 5,000 men and roughly 120 tanks and assault guns, including the new King Tigers, the heaviest armored vehicles in the German inventory. Pieper had been told that his column would lead the German breakthrough to the Meuse River. He had been told that speed was everything. He had been told, in language that would later be argued about in courtrooms, that prisoners were a complication he was not to indulge. His column moved west into Belgium through the morning of December 16th and into the 17th. It reached a crossroads near the village of Baugnes, just south of the Belgian town of Malmedy, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon on December 17th. At the crossroads, a small American convoy was passing through. Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Approximately 140 men in trucks. They were not a combat unit. They were observers, surveyors, men whose job was to track the fall of artillery shells and call corrections back to the gun batteries. They were lightly armed. They were not expecting the war to be coming up the road behind them. The lead tanks of Pieper's column opened fire on the convoy. The American trucks were destroyed in minutes. The survivors, perhaps 120 men, came out of the vehicles with their hands up. They were herded into the snow-covered field at the southwest corner of the crossroads. What happened next is documented by the testimony of the men who survived it and by the bodies of the men who did not. For reasons that would be argued at a tribunal for the next 10 years, the SS troops standing guard over the prisoners opened fire with their machine pistols and their rifles. The prisoners broke. Some ran. Most were killed where they stood. The wounded, who fell into the snow, were walked over by individual SS soldiers and shot in the head at close range. The shooting in the field lasted approximately 15 minutes. The cleanup, the methodical killing of the wounded, lasted longer. 84 American prisoners of war were murdered in the snow at the Baugnes crossroads on the afternoon of December 17, 1944. Some men survived by feigning death in the pile of bodies and crawling away after dark. It would become known to history as the Malmedy Massacre. It was not that day the only one. On the same date, December 17, 1944, 10 miles to the east, in the small Belgian village of Wereth, 11 other American soldiers were also being killed. This is the part of the story almost no one outside of a small community of researchers knows. The 11 men were soldiers of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. They were Black Americans. The 333rd was a segregated artillery unit, one of several that the United States Army had organized for the European theater, under the doctrine of segregation that the country had not yet found the will to abandon. The 11 men had become separated from their unit during the chaos of the first hours of the German offensive. They had walked through the woods. They had been hungry. They had been cold. They had reached the village of Wereth at dusk. A Belgian farmer had taken them into his home and given them food and warmth. Someone in the village had informed the Germans. A reconnaissance element of the 1st SS Panzer Division came to the farmhouse and forced the 11 men out into the snow. The men had surrendered. They had been unarmed. They had been moved into a field a short distance from the house. There, in the dark, they had been tortured before they were killed. Their bones had been broken. Their fingers had been cut off. Their bodies had been bayoneted. They had been finally shot, in the snow, in the cold, in a field in Belgium, 10 miles east of where 84 other Americans were lying dead, in another field, for similar reasons. The bodies at Wereth were not found by American forces for 6 weeks. They were not buried as the bodies at Malmedy were buried. They did not become a documented atrocity in the public American memory. The Army investigation, when it finally happened, was filed and forgotten. The 11 men were listed as combat casualties. The story did not enter the official record. It did not enter the war crimes proceedings at Dachau. It did not enter the speeches. It would take 50 years for the story to come back. In 1994, a small group of Belgian citizens, working with American historians, would erect a memorial in the field where the 11 men had died. The United States Congress would formally recognize the massacre in 2017, 73 years after the killing, and the families of the 11 men would receive, after the lifetimes of their parents and most of their siblings, the acknowledgement that the country they had served had owed them since December 17, 1944. In December of 1944, however, no one outside of the SS unit that had committed the killings knew it had happened. News of Malmedy reached 3rd Army headquarters within hours. Patton was in his office, working a map. The map was bad. The map showed his army facing east, in Lorraine, well over 100 miles south of where the German breakthrough was happening. He had begun to suspect, several days before the offensive began, that the Germans had something planned in the Ardennes. He had ordered his staff to begin drawing contingency plans without telling the higher commands what he was doing. The contingency plans were on the table. Codman came into the office with the report from Malmedy. Patton read it. He set the report down. The men around him expected what they had learned to expect when Patton received news of this kind. They expected the explosive theatrical anger, the rhetoric, the call for vengeance. They expected, given that it was Patton, that he would draft an order on the spot directing his subordinates to take no SS prisoners alive. He did not. He did the opposite. Patton drafted an order that afternoon addressed to all corps and division commanders of the 3rd Army. The order, in the language of the day, reaffirmed the requirements of the Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. It noted the reports of German violations on the Northern Front. It directed all officers and non-commissioned officers in the 3rd Army to ensure that captured SS personnel were processed according to the same standards as Wehrmacht prisoners. It noted that retaliatory killings would be subject to investigation and, where evidence was found, to court-martial under the Articles of War. The order went out. His staff did not understand it. Some of them, privately, were angry. The men in the field had heard about Malmedy by then. They wanted to do something. They wanted a sign from the general that the killings on the snow at Baugnies would be answered in kind on the German side of the line. Patton would not give it to them. He believed, and his diary from these days makes clear, that the moment the 3rd Army began killing prisoners in retaliation was the moment the 3rd Army became indistinguishable from the SS units it was fighting. That was not a moral abstraction to him. That was an operational reality. An army that broke its own discipline could not be trusted to hold a line when the line bent. And an army that killed prisoners would eventually refuse to take them. And an enemy who knew he could not surrender would fight to the last cartridge, and the Third Army would bleed for that fact one bullet at a time for the rest of the war. The order stood. 2 days later, on December 19th, Patton was summoned to a meeting at Eisenhower's headquarters in the city of Verdun. The room was cold. The fireplace was small and inadequate. The senior American commanders sat round a long table in their winter coats. Eisenhower presided. Bradley sat to his right. Patton sat across from them. The atmosphere in the room was tight, with the kind of strain that senior officers communicated to each other through small silences and the deliberate way they handled their coffee cups. Eisenhower addressed Patton directly. The northern shoulder of the Bulge was holding. The southern shoulder, at the town of Bastogne, was nearly surrounded by German armor. The 101st Airborne Division was inside Bastogne. They were going to be cut off within 48 hours. The American forces north of the Bulge could not relieve them. The British under Montgomery were not yet in position. Only the Third Army, currently facing east in Lorraine, was within striking distance. Eisenhower asked how soon Patton could attack north. Patton said 48 hours. The room went quiet. The other generals had been quietly briefing each other for hours that any movement of the Third Army's mass on this scale would take 10 days. Patton was talking of turning 3 divisions 90 degrees in the dead of winter, on icy roads, in fog, against a moving enemy, and beginning a major counterattack before the end of the week. It was, by every measure of military logistics, impossible. Patton had already done it. He had begun moving the divisions before he left for the conference. He had given his staff 3 contingency plans, color-coded before he had departed. He had a code word arranged. He was going to make a single phone call from Eisenhower's headquarters back to his own, and the operation would begin. He made the phone call. The Third Army turned. What happened in the next 72 hours has been studied at the United States Army Command and General Staff College for 70 years. And 3 divisions, with their artillery and their supply trains and their fuel and their ammunition, executed a 90-degree rotation across a road network that had not been designed for it, in weather that should have stopped it, over distances that should have required twice the time. The mistakes were small. The improvisations were many. The men were exhausted. The trucks burned out their transmissions. The tank crews slept standing up while their vehicles refueled. By the morning of December 22nd, the lead elements of the Third Army were attacking north toward Bastogne. And inside Bastogne, on those same days, the siege had begun to take its own particular shape. The town was held by elements of the 101st Airborne Division and parts of the 10th Armored Division. There were approximately 18,000 American soldiers inside the perimeter, and the Germans had surrounded them on all sides. The wounded were pouring into the town's makeshift aid stations faster than the medical personnel could process them. A battalion surgeon named Jack T. Pryor, captain in the medical corps, had set up his aid station in the Heinz Barracks, a stone military building at the southern edge of the town. He had no nurses. He had 2 medics. The wounded were arriving by the hundreds. On the morning of December 21st, Pryor put out a call into the town. He needed help. He needed anyone who could nurse, dress wounds, change bandages, hold a soldier's hand while he died. 2 women came forward. One was Augusta Chiwi. She was 23 years old, Belgian by upbringing, the daughter of a Belgian veterinarian father and a Congolese mother. She had trained as a nurse in Leuven. She had come to Bastogne to visit her family for Christmas. The other was Renée Lemaire. She was 30. She had been born in Bastogne, the the daughter of a hardware store owner. She had trained as a nurse in Brussels. She had been engaged to a Jewish man who had been arrested by the Gestapo earlier that year and taken away, and she had not heard from him since. She had come back to Bastogne to be with her parents. Both women had been trapped in the town when the German offensive cut the roads. They walked into Pryor's aid station on the morning of December 21st and began to work. They worked through the 22nd. They worked through the 23rd. They worked while the cold deepened, while the supply situation in the town reached its worst point, while the German artillery walked rounds across the streets in long, deliberate patterns. The wounded came and came. Captain Pryor would later write of Renée Lemaire that her presence in the aid station was, in the literal sense, what kept the wounded soldiers alive who would otherwise have given up. On the evening of December 24th, the Luftwaffe came. It was Christmas Eve. A flight of German bombers crossed the Bastogne perimeter at altitude in the late afternoon. They dropped their loads in deliberate patterns across the town center. One 500-pound bomb fell on the Heinz barracks at approximately 8:30 in the evening. The aid station was destroyed in seconds. Approximately 30 wounded American soldiers were killed instantly. Renée Lemaire was killed in the blast. Captain Pryor would later find her body in the cellar. Augusta Chiwi, who had been in a separate room when the bomb hit, was thrown through a wall and survived. The Christmas Eve of 1944 passed in the snow over the ruins. 2 days later, on the morning of December 26th, the lead tanks of Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' task force, part of the 4th Armored Division of Patton's Third Army, broke through the German encirclement and reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The siege was over. Patton had done what he had told Eisenhower he would do, on the schedule he had said he would do it on, in conditions that had not allowed it. He arrived in Bastogne 3 days later. He walked through the wreckage of the Heinz Barracks aid station. He did not speak for some time. In his diary, in an entry written on the night of January 4th, 1945, after he had visited the surviving aid stations, and after the report on Renée Lemaire had crossed his desk, and after the full picture of what the SS had done across the Ardennes had become clear, George Patton wrote a sentence that, depending on how it is read, captures the whole contradiction of the man. He wrote, in unmistakable language, that the SS as an institution would have to be destroyed entirely. The words on the page were the words of a soldier whose patience with a particular enemy had ended. On the same page, in the same entry, on the same evening, he reaffirmed the standing order that captured SS personnel in the Third Army Zone would be processed according to the Geneva Convention. Both sentences were Patton. 3 days earlier, on January 1st, 1945, in a small Belgian village called Chenone, soldiers of the 11th Armored Division, under his command, on a road south Bastogne, had executed approximately 60 German prisoners of war. The men had been captured during a small engagement. They had been disarmed. They had been lined up against a hedge. They had been shot. Patton knew within 48 hours. His diary entry of January 4th contains, in the language of a man writing for himself in a private notebook, the wish that the incident at Chenone would not become public. He did not order an investigation. He did not court-martial the officers responsible. He filed the knowledge away in the same place where the rest of the war was stored. The folder in the JAG tent, the one that contained the violations on both sides, the one Patton had built since October, included Chenone. It did not leave the tent. The principle Patton had announced in October, that the law applied to both sides, had survived 3 months of combat and one of the bloodiest German atrocities of the war. It would not survive the snow on the first day of January. This was the fact he carried into the rest of the war. This was the contradiction the diaries would record. This was George Patton in the winter of 1944 into 1945, the man who had insisted on the file and the man who had hoped, in the cold of a Belgian village, that one of the files would never be opened. The Third Army drove east. The war drove with it. And in the locked box in the jag tent, the paper continued, patient, indifferent, accumulating the names. The Third Army crossed the Rhine River on March 22nd, 1945. The fighting after that had a different quality than what had come before. The German formations they encountered were thinner. The resistance was sporadic. The villages surrendered, when they surrendered at all, with white sheets hanging from upper windows and old men in civilian clothes standing in the squares, with their hands folded in front of them, like men attending a funeral they had not been invited to. The Third Army moved east. The roads opened. The maps stopped being useful because the maps had been drawn for a Germany that was, by the end of March, beginning to disappear. On April 4th, 1945, the 4th Armored Division of the Third Army, moving along a forest road in central Germany, came over a low ridge and found the Ohrdruf concentration camp. It was a small camp, a subsidiary of Buchenwald. What the soldiers found when they walked through the gates that morning was something for which their training had not prepared them, and for which no language in any of the briefing books had a sufficient word. Bodies stacked in cordwood patterns. Bodies that had been shot in the back of the head during the German evacuation of the camp the previous week and left in the snow because there had been no time to bury them. The smell, the cold air. The few survivors, who were not really survivors yet, only living, sitting against the walls of the wooden barracks with the particular silence of people who have stopped expecting anyone to come. Patton arrived at Ohrdruf on the morning of April 12th. Eisenhower was with him. Bradley was with them. George Patton, who had spent 40 years building a public persona of theatrical hardness, who had written about combat in language that sometimes glorified it, who had been at this point in his career one of the most decorated and visible fighting generals in the United States Army, walked into Ohrdruf, looked at what was there, and was sick. He went around a corner of one of the buildings, and he vomited in the snow. Eisenhower did not. Patton wept later, in private, in the company of one of his aides. He did not weep in front of the camp. Instead, he did something operational. He ordered that the civilian population of the nearest towns be assembled and walked through the camp. They would see what had been done in their name. They would not be permitted the comfort of not knowing. The order went out. The townspeople came. They were old men and women and children. They walked through the camp in their Sunday clothes, with their hands at their sides, with their faces gone blank, with the soldiers of the Third Army watching them and saying nothing. That night, Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice. He told her he had seen many horrible things in 40 years of soldiering, but nothing had prepared him for this. He told her it was important that it be written down. All of it, he wrote. The folder in the jag tent, the one that had begun with Frances Slanger in October, had by April of 45 become part of a larger thing, an apparatus of evidence gathering. Across the entire United States Army in Europe, 10,000 investigators and clerks and stenographers in canvas tents and requisitioned schoolhouses across the recovered territory, taking statements, photographing the dead, numbering the boxes, filing the paper. The war ended on the 8th of May, 1945. Patton would not see the trials. On the afternoon of December 9th, 1945, on a quiet road near the German town of Mannheim, the staff car carrying General George S. Patton collided at low speed with an army truck that had turned across his lane. The other passengers in both vehicles were uninjured. Patton's neck was broken. He was taken to a military hospital in Heidelberg. He was conscious. He could not move. He lived for 12 days. He died on the evening of December 21st, 1945, in his sleep, with his wife Beatrice in the room. He never heard a verdict from a war crimes tribunal. The first verdicts from the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg would not be read until the 1st of October, 1946, 10 months after Patton's death. The Malmedy trial, the one that prosecuted the SS men of Kampfgruppe Pieper for the murders at the Baugnes crossroads, would not open until May 16, 1946, at the former concentration camp of Dachau, designated by the United States Army as case number 624. 73 SS defendants stood in the dock at Dachau in the summer of 1946. 43 were sentenced to death. 22 were sentenced to life imprisonment. The remainder received lesser terms. Joachim Pieper, the commander, the man who had given the orders, was sentenced to be hanged. The documentation that Patton had insisted on since October of 1944 was in the proceedings at Dachau part of the foundation. Not the only foundation. There were other JAG officers in other commands that had done the same work. But the Third Army's files were among the most complete, and the cases that came out of Patton's theater were prosecuted with a strength of evidence that the defense found difficult to challenge on the facts. And the facts, however, were not the only thing that mattered. In 1948, a United States Senate subcommittee opened an investigation into allegations that the prosecutors at the Malmedy trial had used coercive interrogation methods on the SS defendants. The investigation was driven, in part, by a young senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy, who had taken up the cause of the convicted men with a vehemence that puzzled some of his colleagues at the time and would acquire darker contexts later. The Senate's findings were mixed. Some abuses were documented. The convictions were not overturned, but the sentences began to soften. In 1951, Pieper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. In 1956, after 11 years in custody, Joachim Pieper was released. But while the man walked out of his cell, the law he had broken was being rewritten. In the summer of 1949, 4 years after Patton's death, the nations of the world gathered in Geneva to revise the conventions on the conduct of war. The revisions drew, directly and explicitly, on what the investigators of the Allied armies had documented across the European theater in 1944 and 1945. The prohibition on attacking medical personnel was strengthened. The protections for prisoners of war were expanded. The definition of war crime was clarified. The legal architecture that had not existed when Patton sat in his tent in Nancy and ordered a file opened on a dead nurse, that architecture now existed. It was written. It was signed. It became law in every nation that joined the conventions, and it remains the law in our own time, in every theater where soldiers go. The man himself, meanwhile, returned to Germany. He worked, for a time, in the automotive industry. He eventually moved across the border into the small French village of Treves in the eastern part of the country, where he lived quietly in a house at the edge of the woods. On the night of July 14, 1976, the house was set on fire. Pieper was inside. He was 61 years old. He was, in the period before the fire, receiving anonymous threats and had told friends he expected something to happen. His body was found in the burned-out shell of the building the following morning. He had been shot. The arsonists were never identified. The case was closed without a conviction. This was the resolution. It was not the resolution George Patton had imagined when he had ordered the folder begun in October of 1944. The justice that emerged from the Dachau trials was real but imperfect, contested, partial. Sentences were softened. Men were released. The line between accountability and politics blurred. Almost from the moment the war ended, and it had been blurring ever since. Frances Slanger has a hospital ship named after her. The ship served until 1946 and was decommissioned. There is a plaque in Boston. There is a street. René Lemaire has a memorial in Bastogne on the wall of a building marking the place where the aid station once stood. Augusta Chiwi lived until the year 2015. She was decorated, late in life, by both the Belgian government and the United States Army. She gave one interview near the end, in which she said only that she had done what was in front of her to do. The men of the Wereth 11 have a memorial in Belgium, built by neighbors, recognized by the United States Congress in 2017. George Patton lies in the American Military Cemetery at Ham, Luxembourg, in a grave that is not larger than the graves of the men around him by his own instruction. He is buried among his soldiers. The folder is gone. What it contained, the patient assembly of names and dates and shells and bodies, became the law, and the law remains. Remember the nurse. Remember what was written down. Remember that someone in the cold of a tent in Nancy, in the autumn of a war that would not end, refused to look away.